Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Florian Scheuer. I'm chairing the session this afternoon on how to do business amidst the globalization backlash, which promises to be extremely interesting. Each of the three panelists here will give a presentation for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have questions from me, from you in the audience, just like we did this morning. Our three speakers here this afternoon are unusually exciting in the combination of expertise that they bring to this panel. So let me start with introducing them. Starting from your very left, we have Beatrice Weder di Mauro. She's currently Distinguished Fellow in Residence at INSEAD Singapore, as well as a Professor of Economics at the University of Mainz in Germany. She's a leading expert on macroeconomics and international finance, and has a wide range of experience both as an active researcher in these areas and as an advisor to various governments and major corporations. For instance, she was the first woman and the first non-German member of the German Council for Economic Experts. As many of you probably know, this council in the media is often referred to as the 5 sages of the economy, die 5 Wirtschaftsweisen in German. So I think we can expect some particularly wise words from Beatrice today. She will start with telling us about the role she sees for businesses in the political discourse that we currently have about free trade versus protectionism. She also serves on the board of UBS, quite fittingly for today's event. So in view of her expertise in banking, she will also emphasize the role of the financial industry in the context of globalization and its backlash, if there is one. So Beatrice, thank you very much for being here with us today. As our second speaker, we'll then have Karl Gernandt seated here in the middle. He's the executive chairman of the Kühne holding, as well as vice chairman of the board of directors of Kühne & Nagel International, which I'm sure many of you are aware of is a leading global logistics company that accounts for a significant share of the worldwide sea and air freight business. As a result, I guess I'm not exaggerating when I say that he basically knows about every single container that is currently being shipped anywhere in the world in real time. So he'll be able to tell us exactly what the current situation of world trade looks like and where he thinks it's going. I also look forward to hearing from him whether he can actually see any indications for the globalization backlash that we have in the title of our session here, or whether he thinks it's all talk, no action so far. Karl Gernandt is also on the board of Hapag-Lloyd, another major logistics company, and he was chairman and is still involved with the HSV, which he told me over lunch is not quite a logistics company, but in fact the football club of his hometown, Hamburg. So I'm sure that if you were to ask him, he could share some fascinating insights about the effect of globalization on the market for soccer players as well. I'm not going to ask him because I was told not to talk too much about football this afternoon, but you are free to ask him whatever you want. And then finally, on your very right, we're very excited to have Laura Alfaro as our third speaker. She is the Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School and a leading international expert on international economics and emerging markets. In particular, she's done some influential research on the organization of firms in a global context, with the focus on vertical integration, multinational production, international value chains, and capital flows across countries. We're going to hear from her about the strategies that she recommends businesses to follow in view of the fundamental challenge to trade policy that are currently on the horizon. Laura is also a prolific policy consultant to institutions such as the United Nations, various central banks, World Bank, and the IMF. And perhaps most intriguingly, she served as Minister of National Planning of her home country, Costa Rica, from 2010 to 2012. So we might have a chance to learn from her what exactly national planning means in the 21st century. And of course, I'm curious to see her perspective on trade policy, both from the point of view of the US. We've heard a lot of speculation about what Trump might be up to in the coming months. She's from the US, so maybe she can tell us a little bit more about what she knows about this, and also the perspective of emerging economies like Costa Rica. So as you can see, I'm really looking forward to the discussion we'll have on this panel, and without further ado, Beatrice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Florian. Thank you very much to the UBS Center for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Zurich. I have decided not to show any slides today, but I will rely a little bit on your power of imagination and visualization as I describe a graph in a minute. So what I'm planning to do is first to ask, is there really deglobalization, and what do we mean by it? What is, if there is, driving it? And I will distinguish between trade and finance, and then address the question of how business is adapting to this, or should be adapting to it, again, distinguishing between trade and finance. And finally, I will ask the question, what is the role of business and business leaders in fighting a globalization backlash? Can we rely on this type of leadership? And what are the prospects for the rise in populism? So first, globalization, where do we stand? We already heard this morning from Kevin that this is not the first time we have had globalization and deglobalization. And if you try to picture the last 150 years, then the picture for trade looks something like this. There is an initial increase of globalization as trade was growing faster than GDP. So trade over GDP is increasing, and it is increasing for about 50 years between 1850 and the first big deglobalization with the start of the First World War. And it reaches something in the area of 30% of GDP as a max. And then there is a long period where we have a deglobalized world, where trade is not growing at the same rate as GDP, or just very slightly so. So it stays more or less flat. And then we start to have the new increase, what we call now the second era of globalization. And for the same group of countries as in the first era of globalization, that looks like this, that sometime around the year 2000, the globalization of the second Mark era actually is higher than the one of the first. So it goes above 30% of GDP. If we then also include if we also include all countries, the poorer countries and the emerging markets where the globalization was particularly pronounced, then the number there is about 60% of GDP, that the increase that was reached over the last years. So when we're talking about deglobalization, then we are talking about the very last bit of that. So the first thing to notice is globalization as it stands, it's still at its peak, historically, when we're talking about trade. And what we have observed is, first in the global financial crisis, a rapid decline, and then a certain recovery, and after that, a very low growth of trade. And this is what usually is now meant when people talk about deglobalization. Notice that at the very, very last end, there is a tick up again. And trade is, in fact, now growing faster than GDP again. So that's the part about deglobalization in terms of trade that we're talking about. When we look at finance, the picture is a little bit different. Again, you have the hump of finance and international integration measured as assets plus liability. And the BIS, by the way, that the graph I'm describing has it in its annual report, where it's a very nice chapter about globalization. And so you see this hump in the internationalization of finance in the first era of globalization. And now, in the second era of globalization, however, the increase is much, much larger. So there it goes from very low numbers to almost 400% of GDP, of global GDP. And in other words, globalization in finance was much, much larger than in trade, and it grew faster. But the last stylized fact I want to mention here, it's mostly this type of strong increase in financial globalization was mostly between advanced countries. It's not so much between advanced countries and emerging markets or the poorer countries. And there again, after the financial crisis, what you see is a retrenchment. You see that by that measure of globalization, that one just declines and stays lower. So in that last bit, there is financial deglobalization. So much for the stylized facts. Now, what are the reasons? What is driving this last deglobalization? Well, in terms of trade, and in terms of also how business should adapt to that, it's important to know whether these are temporary or structural factors that are leading to the relative deglobalization. When we're talking about trade, there is no question that demand played a large role. So from the financial crisis and its repercussions, the decline in trade and in demand and investment was an important reason for this deglobalization period. However, there are also possibly more structural factors. So China's role has already been emphasized this morning. And what we see is China is shifting its business model as a country. It's shifting from an export-led type of industrialization to a more domestic growth model. And this has repercussions that go way beyond China's borders. In fact, the region where I now live, all of Asia, is in tune with the decline in trade in China, has also faced quite a strong repercussions from that strong negative spillover, so to say, from this change in Chinese business model. Then there is some evidence that also global value chains that also have been alluded to may have been retrenching somewhat. So a certain renationalization of global value chains has been observed, and the OECD has documented it. Whether that is going to be temporary or structural or more longer term is still to be decided. And finally, the last factor, what we are most worried about, the thing that is creating most noise, is of course the question whether there is an increase in protectionism. Clearly, so far, most of the, in most numbers, we don't see clear increase of protectionism, but clearly we see it in the noises that we hear, or put differently, in the announcements. Brexit is a clear announcement, which is a deglobalization. I mean, British may say, they want to go for global, but the first order impact is to leave a free trade zone, and therefore I would call that deglobalization. And the announcements by the US president also at this stage are more in the scale of announcements than already realized deglobalizations. But the question whether that's going to be temporary or structural is also still an open one. Ultimately, we probably all hope that they may not be as structural as they sounded initially. Now to finance. I already mentioned in finance also, after the financial crisis, what you see is a retrenchment. In other words, the financial institutions are shedding assets abroad. And in fact, they're shedding it more than at home. In other words, there is a going home effect. The home bias across the advanced countries increases. And therefore, and the question there is, well, was this just a reaction as a need to rebuild balance sheet? Was this just a reaction to the financial crisis, or is this also something that is going to remain? So while I have argued in the case of trade that much of what we saw in terms of deglobalizing in trade maybe turn out to be temporary, in this case, in the particular case of finance and regulated financial institutions, I do not think that this is temporary. I think there is a structural change, in fact, which is, built into the regulatory frameworks that have now emerged after the financial crisis, where it's the protection of the national taxpayer and the regulatory response to that basically has led to a change also in the business, to a needed change in the business model of financial institutions. In other words, what then translates into business models that are much more decentralized, where we have subsidiaries in different large constituencies, and where you also will find that capital and liquidity have to be kept at national levels, and therefore are more trapped. That this kind of evolution is not going to go away, but rather, business and banks have to adapt to it and are indeed changing their business models accordingly. So a certain deglobalization in that sense is already well underway. However, this of course does not affect to the same extent the not regulated financial sector. And that's one of the consequences that we see, is that in the non-regulated financial sector there is a lot of growth. So in other words, last week I was at a conference of the IMF, Bank of England, and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. the whole discussion was is where do we stand in terms of macroprudential tools that have been developed during in the aftermath of the crisis, and how are they working? And one way that one regulator put it is to say, well, sometimes it is, of course, a little bit that we are squeezing on one side, which is the regulated sector, but it's like a balloon. There is the air is going into other parts of the balloon. And certainly, if you look at a big country like China that I've already mentioned before, we can see that a lot of the worries that are now present in terms of China and will China be sustainable are in the shadow banking system. It's a huge growth in debt that is taking place there, financed by shadow banking institutions. So my last point is about. So in terms of, just to summarize this, for finance, especially for the regulated sector, I think the deglobalization to a certain extent is going to be permanent, and business models have to adapt to that. Now, last point, how about not adapting to changing conditions, but how can we think about leadership of the private sector, of the business world, in fighting for globalization? And so here, the first thing is, I said, we can't really rely on that. The first way that an economist approaches protectionism is by looking at what are the distributional consequences from that, and it turns out that it's always the more inefficient local producers that benefit from protectionism at the cost of more efficient foreign producers, and of course at the cost of consumers. But what is not emphasized very much is that also internally there are other sectors that typically do not benefit from protectionism. What do I mean with this? Now, businessmen, when they go into government, tend to often think that a country is like a company. And in fact, Paul Krugman wrote a long time ago a piece which is very interesting, and you may want to read up on that, called A Country is Not a Company. And what is the difference, the important difference between them? Well, ultimately it boils down to a company is ultimately an open system, and the country is not. So when somebody comes back when a state secretary comes back to the country and says, oh, I have brought 20,000 new jobs to this country because I've made a deal abroad. I am a very good deal maker, and I made a deal, and I brought back these jobs. Then one of the most important questions is, well, where are these jobs going to come from? Are they going to come directly from the people that are unemployed? Well, probably most of them will come from other companies where people that have been working will leave that company, and the mechanism to make that work is that wages have to increase in order to have this reallocation of resources. In other words, there are losers inside. There are sectors that were profitable before, that were competitive, and that may directly lose from this kind of intervention. So in that sense, that's the Krugman story that I just gave you in a nutshell. In that sense, the instincts that a businessman may have in terms of making deals work for a company do not work the same way for a country. And that's why we distinguish between, business administration, BWL at universities, and VWL, which has the country as a unit of account, so to say. And why I would suggest that this distinction is very important, not only because some of us here think that economics and VWL is the thing that you should be studying, but because there are actually other consequences. So let me stop here just by saying, yes, there are repercussions from deglobalization for business. Business leaders have a big role also to play, but they are not. We can't necessarily assume that businessmen and business leaders are going to be in favor of globalization. And therefore, the primacy of politics and of a world order, to maintain an open world order, has to be assumed. Of course, I know that there are, we all know that there are also other business leaders, as we will just hear one, I'm sure, who are very much fighting for globalization and understand its benefits. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Florian, thank you very much for having me here. It's more than a pleasure for me. And it's a rare situation that a businessman is standing in front of highly calibrated intellectual capacities. And you might think, what kind of role do I take here on that podium? Now, I've decided to share with you some thoughts, some considerations I have from my point of perspective of being responsible in an environment which is dominated by global logistics, be it in a shipping line, be it in a forwarding business like Kühne and Nagel. And if I want to start in addressing the theme of today's workshop on how to do business amidst the globalization backlash, there's already an implication with it, an implication that there is a globalization backlash. And I dare to confess that I am not believing in a backlash, and I want to convince you at least to follow one of those thoughts which put me into that judgment. The term globalization is often used to describe the developments since the beginning of industrialization in the 19th century, which goes hand in hand with a massive increase in global trade. But the globalization story actually, from my point of view, started much earlier, and it is not just a result of a groundbreaking new technology like the train, like the ship itself. It's by far a more fundamental trend, looking at globalization as something that is probably deeply rooted in our DNA, would help to reposition the globalization phenomenon as a natural continuum, not as something that can be turned on or off. Many interesting books have been written about the history of globalization. However, the current public debate around this topic would benefit from reflections on long-term and longer-term developments in order to see and create new alternatives going forward. The globalization continuum has been fueled by trade and logistics, of course. But next to trade that can be measured, globalization happens and impacts what I call our soft tissues. Take any aspect of human life, cultures, fashion, languages, religions, economic systems, you name it. All of this is contributing to the continuum of globalization. Communities and nations have changed by integrating people from other communities with other value systems. We have shared that already in the morning session a little bit. And every friendship, every marriage, every new business relationship contributes to narrowing cultural and other gaps. Our soft tissue is definitely becoming global, not regional, not local, and certainly not domestic. Looking at the level of globalization, we have experienced an unprecedented development in terms of speed since World War II, but we are still far away from a truly global economy or global system. Based on various indicators regarding global connectedness, in terms of flow of goods, finance, what Beatrice was reflecting on, people and even information, we have a huge potential for further global integration. Today's level of globalization is therefore far less advanced than one might think. Even experienced business people overestimate the intensity of global integration. At least I was very much impressed by Professor Gernandt from Harvard Business in his book World 3.0. But it is a strong force that is growing fast, if not exponentially. I'm convinced that the current developments and increases in protectionist measures are not signals of a stop or changing gears into reverse, but events of conflicts to shape the next phase of globalization. Essentially, I see globalization as a function and state, and as a state of full equilibrium of the usage and distribution of natural resources, of energy, which includes water, air, and labor. And it is interesting to note that these factors have not been covered yet. But for me as a businessman, I'm sometimes wondering how these goods, water, air, and labor, are incorporated in our ideas about talking about the globalization. And at the end of the day, it's purchasing power and the markets as selectors of and feedback loops for relevant products and services. This is what we see in the data and interaction with our customers. At Kühne + Nagel, we provide logistics and transport services around the world. We do it with more than 70,000 people and more than 1,300 locations globally. Based on our up-to-date knowledge of global markets, our market leader position in sea freight, and sea freight stands for 90% of global trade, and international trade flows, we are often asked, and we ask ourselves, what is going on in that world and what kind of information do we need in order to plan decently and to support our customers. And therefore it was a logical step for me when 3 years ago we combined our logistic knowledge with proprietary and external data, and to offer the resulting market intelligence as a new service to customers from the financial and logistics sectors. 3 years ago, we started this project and created our own data product, Global Kühne + Nagel Indicators, which provides early insights into changes, turning points, and disturbances in world trade. Key economic indicators, such as imports and export statistics, are available 60 days before the official statistics and up to 55 days earlier than other estimates. We know already when a customer is calling us in China that they are asking for an export of a tool and heading for Los Angeles. We know that this initial step is getting an inroad into the statistics 6 weeks down the road. And this puts us in a perfect position in order to predict, in order to judge, and in order to observe certain flows. And what we see at the moment reminds me of other times when globalization was meant to be in retreat. Take the period of the Great Depression in the 30s, for example. Referring to Gernandt's account in his book World 3.0, or his latest Harvard Business Review article, it is obvious that even during these grim times, trade volume was by far less in decline than generally perceived. In other words, trade persisted and resisted when our world was in gloom. I want to share with you some of these data points we are able to gather out of our business. And even though Mr. Trump is building walls along the Mexico frontier, that's what we can observe. And here, first of all, you see the China trend, where we have indicated the exports in blue and the imports in red. We definitely see that there's no indication at all by talking about China and considering a backlash. The same is applicable for the US, where everybody might think that due to the public discussion around connectivity, isolation, and all these issues that we might consider a backlash, but you see the year-on-year curve. Once again, export as well as import is very stable on what we would call the dynamic of globalization. Gernandt and other economic researchers claim is reflected in our own data. Globalization is definitely not in backlash mode. The overheated growth of the last decade has cooled down and starts showing a much more sustainable development. And Beatrice was reflecting on the same fact we are showing here, that the trade volume growth and the world real GDP has been disturbed seriously in the 2009, 2008, 2009 financial crisis, but then came back into a balance, which still stands for around 1.0 in terms of world GDP growth in comparison to world trade. And actually, the data we are able to look at possibly taken on a global scale as well as on a by country scale, which helps us to supply certain capacities and to certain regions. But even realizing we need to take the anti-globalization discourse extremely serious. It is the expression of real and perceived fear of a growing number of people to lose their current status quo or to be pushed to the lower end of our societies. Riding on the back of these fears allows politicians to drive home easy points supporting nationalistic and protectionist trends, and we have experienced that in France and Germany and not only in the US. Protectionist claims are not viable options or remedies against these fears. The social, economic and environmental challenge we are facing transcend national borders and can only be solved by further integration, also even more so at global level. But now let's talk about doing business in such an environment. As a company that has been thriving and benefiting from globalization and as a result has become a global player in terms of people and locations, we are also very susceptible and exposed to respective local changes. The volatility and speed at which the system of globalization creates new challenges for us in this environment is extraordinary. There are many aspects to consider, but in the context of our panel this afternoon, I would like to focus on three: complexity, diversity, and resources. First, about complexity. Like many other businesses, logistics and transportation has undoubtedly become more complex. What usually starts as a simple conversation between a shipper and a consignee ends in an exchange of information within a highly complex system, combining the flow of physical goods, information related to that flow to the exchange of financial values. In other words, that's what we call trade. Successful trade at company level requires the ability to read the relevant signals in a swelling ocean of data and to act amidst the often conflicting data. New and better technologies are creating new levels of complexity. How do you take the right short, mid, and long-term decision in such an environment? Secondly, diversity. The global trade engine, fueled by rising purchasing power of the middle class, has not created global classes of homogeneous consumers. Actually, I'm only aware of 3 truly global products which are existing. That's the Big Mac, that's the Coca-Cola bottle, and that's the iPhone. No other product is exactly in the same manner delivered globally. So globalization is definitely not at its end. It's at the very first beginning. If you might have other products which you would consider or which you would call global in mind, please give me a note, because then I would incorporate that into my next speeches. But at the moment, I'm really stuck with these 3 examples I just shared with you. Another key aspect of diversity relates to the composition of our workforce. In a globalized environment, in not so many years from now, the majority of our workforce at Kühne will be located in Asia, South America, Middle East, and Africa. Definitely not in Switzerland, definitely not in Europe. Thirdly, resources. The recent and devastating hurricanes in the Americas and elsewhere have brought back the discussion on climate change and extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. What is our role as business leader in this regard, especially if you're making money on transporting, primarily with fossil fuels, goods from A to B? The consequence of all these dynamics is determined by how well we are capable, open and willing to constantly and proactively adapt our companies' operating system. This goes hand in hand with a renewed sense of sustainability and social responsibility. All of this I call adaptiveness. Let me explain. In a world that is becoming increasingly complex and diverse, we must learn and structure our organizations in a way that allows us to read and to act on market signals that influence the features of our services or products. We must anticipate behavioral changes of our customers and end consumers. Just to focus on optimizing our processes of cutting cost, this will lead us straight into what I call the efficiency trap, which happens to all successful companies, diverting too much of their energy to process optimization and not enough to understanding the world they are operating in. The globalization pendulum might oscillate in reaction to events of foreseeable and unforeseeable crises, such as the Arab Spring, Fukushima, the Ukraine crisis, 9/11. You might mention it. But it doesn't change the underlying dynamic towards the described equilibrium. Doing business in these times requires a viewpoint that is global and forward-looking. Creating scenarios is a daily task of every man in a management. So living up to that principle of adaptiveness, ladies and gentlemen, means to depart from traditional organizational and leadership dogmas. It starts with our employees. They are our sensors of emerging trends and changes. Equipped with the right tools, such as predictive analytics, they can not only recognize patterns of consumption, but will also be able to propose the necessary adaptive changes. In order to understand how the world is moving, you need a lot of different sensors. Empowerment and awareness is therefore one of the key principles of adaptiveness. Without waiting to be handed down the stone tablet from above, employees with management tasks will start adapting products and services in their field of responsibility. So it's turning an upside down of an organizational self-understanding. And last but not least, sustainability and social responsibility. The fast pace of which consumption has increased over the last 30 years has gone hand in hand with extraction, distribution, and usage of natural resources. In the face of hardening scientific data regarding global warming and the slow response by governments and international organizations, doing business requires that companies acknowledge their respective social responsibility and care for the environment. Business like logistics have always been acting locally, providing services that reduce the distance between markets that are geographically distant. Business with global presence are to be seen as the link between people, markets, and products. More and more companies start to realize that you can not only take profit without giving back or caring for the communities in which you are either producing or selling your products or services. Ladies and gentlemen, let me summarize as follows for hypothesis. Globalization is driven by trade which connects people, cultures, and desires. It's a fundamental system striving for an equilibrium. The journey to this equilibrium may be eternal, but it's definitely not a finite trend. Second, our current data does not support the notion of a backlash at all. The equilibrium principle includes that periods of overheated growth is giving way to a more sustainable growth and adjust the speed of further global integration, which does not change its fundamental dynamic. Third, and second but last, doing business in a globalized world includes the responsibility to balance the use of natural resources at local level with our aims to generate profit. We have to live sustainability. And the last one, empowerment of employees in a much less centralized organization is the only way to become or remain an adaptive and therefore globally successful actor. Sorry for overrunning the time, and thank you for borrowing me your ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the organizers to allow me to come to this great country. I don't know if people from Switzerland know this, but we people from Costa Rica are known as the Switzerland of Central America. That's supposed to be a nice thing for us. I don't know what you think about that, but I do promise Costa Rica is also a pretty country. We also have mountains and cows. So let me give you a little bit of background and perhaps emphasize some of the themes my colleagues in the morning and the afternoon have touched upon. So we're in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. This crisis driven by the excesses as was mentioned, in the financial sector. And I do want to show that we have been growing, but also notice that throughout this period, developing countries have been growing more than rich countries. That, of course, relates to the fact that they're growing from a lower base. But I do want to emphasize that behind some of these trends, there has been development. The pie has increased. And in many of the discussion, and I think it was mentioned also in the morning, do forget that many people have been driven out of poverty in the last decades. So as a background, and I do want to mention that I consider myself a child of globalization. My father had the good fortune to work in a multinational, Weder, which you probably pronounce differently in German. Because of that, we were a middle income family in Costa Rica. My mom studied math. She was the director of a public school. I always knew that if I wanted to study abroad, I needed a scholarship, but I wanted to study abroad, so I went and studied in Chile, in the US. I met my husband, who's Brazilian, and my daughter was born in the US. So in many ways, and also coming from an emerging market, I think I do have to stand up for globalization because my country and many of the people I know have benefited from it. And so we have seen these cross-border flows in goods, service, investment, and also ideas. And we have emphasized the role of trade, but there has been an important technological change behind these trends. The way production is organized has changed, the way we sell, the way we organize. And the classic example is the electronics that chips, where we initially were allowed to differentiate production from R&D, from design. Companies in the US started to go in abroad, but the same trend we see in many products. This is the global value chain, so I would add Intel in chips and chips to your list, and computers to that list. And again, a big part of this change has been driven by technology, to the point that the factory that is now in Mexico producing auto parts, if it comes back to the US, it's not going to hire the same number of workers because it uses a lot of technology, but it's also in Mexico hiring higher skilled workers. It's hiring technicians, it's hiring engineers. So this idea of the unskilled worker, that also perhaps has changed because of technology. There was also important political changes behind these trends. So not only the fall of the Soviet Union, the emergence of the Eastern Bloc in Europe, the emergence of the European project, but as has mentioned, changes in China, but also changes in Latin America. Again, I'm the child of the debt crisis. I'm the child of import substitution, a project that for a small open economy like Costa Rica was not delivering, or had, if you want, reached an end in the 80s. Some of these changes is hard to see going back, and they allow for a lot of the dismantling of trade policy and trade barriers that we have seen. Then came the global financial crisis. Again, perhaps that because of the circumstances of how severe it was, we all rethought some of the changes. And at that time, people were worried about a potential backlash to globalization. Looking back in history, that's what happened, the interwar period. And for a while, it seemed okay. And then we got Brexit. And then we got this guy. I had a different picture. Have you seen one where he's like Voldemort? Because I like that thing of thou who shall not be named, but fine. I do have to say, and again, many of my colleagues have emphasized this, I actually don't think there is this huge backlash. And I think we have always known that there are losers to trade. That is in that textbook that everyone goes if they use that economics. It has been known there are losers to trade. But I think perhaps right now some of them seem a little bit more vocal than in the past. One is Brexit, although I do have to say that Brexit was a vote for the unknown. If you try to get 3 people who voted for Brexit to tell you explicitly what is it that they voted for, they cannot tell you. I think they all had their idea of what Brexit was, and thus we see these negotiations where it has not been made clear. It was also a political move by the Tory party to remain a party. It's unclear to me that will work at the end, but it was a political calculation. And also, I actually do think there has been a lot of anti-migration. And it was mentioned that it's hard to disentangle what is anti-migration when you're voting for your pocket, but I do think there was a lot anti-migration there. In the US, I also want to remind that he didn't get the majority vote out of the fact that he just gets upset with that. But also, I do think that behind this vote, there was a lot of what the US calls the cultural wars, and you see this conservative movement back in the US, some underground more than explicit. But again, I also think there was a lot anti-migration. Some of that discourse is clearly against certain type of migrants, not all migrants. And behind this, and we were discussing it at night, there was this group for taxes, the tax coalition. So it will be interesting to see what happens if they get this tax vote. David showed some of these polls. Actually see these polls in a very interesting way. In the middle of the global financial crisis, the views against trade being good actually increased, but they have been increasing. And they're actually close to 70%, and it's across the board, like it's all political parties. In fact, I call Gallup, because this goes against a lot of the views we're hearing. I call Gallup to ask how you're doing your sample. Because everyone is saying, everyone in the US hates globalization. And you see, again, it's close to 70% that still thinks this is, it brings prosperity. Also, again, fueling my view that this is more about something else than trade, this is the trade data from the US. If you look at what the US exports, one of the main partners are, of course, Canada, but also Mexico and Latin America. In fact, the US exports more goods to Latin America than it imports. If you add services, also, it's even more favorable to the US. The clear trade imbalance in the US is against China, and you have seen how the president was in China last week. I have been talking to friends that are negotiating NAFTA, and they do feel this anti-Mexico bias. Actually, it's a little bit more worrisome than I thought. Apparently, they want to score a win here, and again, as I said, it feels this anti-migration, anti-Mexican, more than really this is what is unbalanced in the US. And what is interesting is that destroying NAFTA probably won't help some of the regions and folks that voted for him. A lot are agricultural goods, that is the Midwest, and it's unclear that's going to bring back the auto industry in the US. So trade does enable countries to use resources more efficiently and increase productivity. There are distribution effects. They are not distributed evenly. Some win, some lose. In particular, it has been in the north, the uneducated, the rural, and the unwilling to change. Technology also is the same. They have allowed for efficiency, but it seems also to have an unskilled bias, negative effects, bias towards the skill. And I mention this because in Latin America, we have also seen a skill premium. So if we were supposed to have a comparative advantage in the things that the US didn't, they would have seen a worse income distribution, but we would have seen the lower skill increase. And we also see the skill bias premium in Latin America. And again, this has led to the replacement of some of the unskilled jobs, and it's also unevenly distributed, mostly to the uneducated, rural, and the unwilling to change. There does seem to be this city advantage, part because of agglomeration economies, part because of these new emerging clusters, but some of the recent trends do seem to be against the rural. And this leads me back to this beautiful movie of the 90s. I don't know if you remember, Full Monty. And this, what I like about this is that this is not new. This was there in the 90s. And what is nice about the movie, and I do recommend you go back and see it, the problem they also faced is that they didn't want to change. They felt that going into the service sector was demeaning. And there is this example, the one that was a police, and the friend comes and gets him. Why are you being a police? This is not what we were. We were manufacturing people. So again, there is something about these changes, and certain type of people, we usually tend to be male and older, that sort of don't like some of these changes. So again, there are effects. There are also adjustment costs on top of the fact that some sectors would lose. And I think the State Secretary went over all the things we can do to solve some of these problems: safety nets, education, and retraining, infrastructure. And in the US is particularly one country that could improve some of its logistics, as you know. Regulation, lowering barriers to businesses, well-functioning financial markets, but also there are more idiosyncratic policies like tax, executive pay, and so on. The irony in both Brexit and the US is that the political parties that are against these programs are the ones that are benefiting from this, if you want, unhappiness. Remember that the US, a lot of these programs are at the state and local level and not at the federal level. And the Republican Party very vocal against, for example, health policy and others, but also trying to push for very low taxes. Kansas is an example where they lower taxes to such a level that they cannot even fund education. Business, trade, and politics. I would argue that even with these broad changes for liberalization, countries have always used protectionism, of course, not at a broader level than we have seen, but there have always been examples of tariffs here, anti-dumping here, subsidies there. And we used to teach cases like, for example, Chiquita bananas, where Europe decided to block US bananas out of particular no reason other than, oh yes, they were protecting some of the bananas produced in Europe. Probably the bananas in Costa Rica were not good enough, but they're better. Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, again, there are many examples of some of these, again, smaller level, but they have always been there. And so global companies that operate in the global trading system should have strategies that contemplate this political risk. They should understand the forces behind this political risk and have scenarios. And again, when there are risks, diversification is one solution. It's an expensive solution, but that is one way one can think of how to tackle some of these risks. But also, think about the role of the private sector. And the private sector is very good at lobbying. You guys know that. I don't need to explain it in many ways and forms. Also, you tend to many times use the comfortable and convenient silences. And I think this is Brexit, and this is what's going on in the US as well. Businesses, in the case of the UK, they favored the Tory party, and so they were silent. In the US, they all perhaps wanted a tax cut, and also they were silent. But building a competitive environment does require decades. The attitudes that are created do have long-lasting effects. If someone believes, and I'm hoping this only will last for years, that the effects of Trump will live with him, sadly, I don't think that will be the case. Some of these anti-migration, anti-everyone else sentiment would sadly linger. Business leaders and firms have a strong influence on the business environment. They shape it directly, they shape it indirectly. And so I think they should collaborate with economic development. They should engage in policy dialogues like this one and try to think more in the system and not perhaps just in the narrow short-term gain. Development, we all gain when there is a relation between GDP growth and the proper distribution. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be losers. It just means that we need to think how we're going to incorporate everyone into the economic opportunities. And if not, I do think Latin America has examples of what can go wrong. We are the region that invented the populists. This is a picture of Perón and then some of my friends from Central America and Venezuela. And the sad thing of this story is that they do feed in the uneducated, they do feed on the poor. And it just turns out that when they come to power and they stay, because for some reason they never leave, it is the poor and uneducated that suffer the most. this has rarely been a recipe for development. It has always been a recipe to create more poverty. Venezuela is one example. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you everyone for your contributions here. So I'm just going to start with asking a few questions and then open up to the audience. Maybe Laura, just start with you because you just talked. So you talked about the important role of the business leaders and the public sector to cooperate to deal with the potentially negative side effects of globalization. So do you think that businesses actually should take over more responsibilities for the potential losers of globalization? And if so, how should they actually do that? Does that mean that they should become more like charities, and maybe that is a bit in conflict with their profit-maximizing goals? Or is that in line with their long-term objectives? And here maybe it'd be cool if you could talk a little bit about your experience as a policymaker in Costa Rica, because I think Costa Rica is called the Switzerland of Latin America, not just because of the cows and mountains, but also because of the success it has had. It hasn't turned into another Venezuela. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, what businesses and policymakers there did that was distinct and allowed for such a success.
So I know business creating corporate social responsibility and charities is much in vogue, and I think if they want to do it, it's fine. I actually do think businesses contribute the most to society when they're trying to act as businesses and maximizing profit. But I think they should have a longer-term view and more of an integrated view, and not just lobby for the little tax that will give me a benefit. I think just having that broad view it's already half the battle. But the other one, I do think they need to engage their political system. I do come from a country that luckily inherited some of the way we do it from the US, which has many problems, but it does allow private sector to be part of government and then go back to the private sector as opposed to the career politicians. And we can debate the pros and cons, but I do think there is an advantage to having this private point of view in government, but also when you go back to businesses, understand some of the constraints and restriction governments face. But as I said, just having an integrated view and not just lobby for your short-term gain, I think would be half the battle.
Karl Gernandt, my question to you is you painted this very optimistic long-run picture of, globalization is a fundamental process that is going to continue even if there's maybe little dips in the political rhetoric. And I just wanted to pick your mind about one long-term change that might actually go against it, which is technological progress. When we know that more and more tasks can be actually now taken over by robots or machines relative to labor, it might become easier to move some of the production that was moved early on to lower wage countries back into rich countries and do the production there with machines instead of labor. And then might that be actually a long-term trend that might reduce the overall amount of goods and inputs that need to be shipped across countries?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And when I was talking about the unstoppable dynamic of globalization in terms of global trade, I was definitely reflecting more on the differentials on labor cost rather than anything else. But I've tried to enlarge the scope, talking about globalization, by reflecting on general aspects. As long as we have differentials in the world, be it education, be it inequality of fundamental needs, we will have a movement of goods and we will have a movement of global aspects, irrespectively whether a robot could be installed in Kentucky as well as in Vietnam, and which would reduce the volume of trade which is connected with it, but the overall need for consumption will stay still alive. And as long as this is not within an equilibrium, and that was the reason why I was reflecting so much on it, I feel that there's maybe a more tearing than a pushing and globalization up to now was primarily done via the ability to push products into markets which were produced on a cheaper level somewhere else in the world. This might be turned into a situation where the goods are more pulled, and this is irrespectively of the production costs. This is based on the equality of knowledge, of living conditions, and whatever you can think of. And then, if I may, and I would come back to what you are saying, you would hope that the business community is taking a longer run perspective rather than to optimize with Panama Papers the tax deduction of their profits, if there's any tax at all paid. But I would have the question to whom we should address. Yes, we are kind of social animal within a global society, but we have to be linked with the government, and the government is changing every 4 years. And where should we address, as a global company, where should we address our impact, our support, our participation too? So I think there's missing the second link as well. We are badly organized in terms of solving global issues, as well as we don't have a counterpart on the other side.
It's funny, we do this at HBS, it's called a COCO. So there are a couple of things on these Panama Papers. I think there are two sides. Then there are like the people, normal persons, and that actually probably is illegal in many countries because they probably should have paid those taxes and they didn't. So having an offshore is not illegal. What is illegal is not to report it. So I assume many of these people just didn't report it, and thus it's illegal. I haven't checked in details. Now, about the companies, I actually think many of these going to Ireland, Jersey, so on and so forth, it has the origin in countries as well. So the US has a very strange way of taxing multinationals. And people say, well, we should all come together as a OECD. No, I think it's as easy as if Congress changes that rule and then taxes profits properly. If you change that, then you won't have all of these Cayman Islands, so on and so forth. So it does have a nationality, and it does have a Congress, and it does have a Congress, a face, if you want. So it's not as faceless as it makes it sound to be. I think it became faceless and started to go from one place to the other because of those rules. But my hunch is if you change those rules, you're going to get companies having more headquarters. Because at the end of the day, I'm sure most of them do want to produce, and they are producing. And a lot of these tax regimes are just the consequence of these bad initial policies.
Now, talking about taxes, actually, let me follow up, because one of the most controversial aspects of the Republican tax reform plan originally was the border tax adjustment, where the idea basically was to make the tax system more destination-based by allowing firms to subtract their exports from their profits when calculating taxes, but no longer allowing them to subtract their imports. Now, from a theoretical standpoint, under general conditions, we would actually expect that this policy change would be fully neutral, because the exchange rate would fully adjust for it to undo the tax change. And still, it was so controversial that, in fact, it was dropped by the Republicans, so it's no longer part of the tax reform plan.
To be fair, that undoing by the exchange rate is also under certain assumptions.
Yeah, this is under certain assumptions, but maybe this is a question to Beatrice as the macroeconomist on this panel. Do you think more generally that exchange rate adjustments would, when we have these maybe more protectionist policies in the future, that exchange rate might mitigate some of these policies, or actually move to make them even more against trade?
Well, I would summarize the consensus in the profession as saying we lean towards the neutrality result, i.e., if you impose such a border tax, then the exchange rate will adjust and will compensate, and it, therefore, as when you look at it from a macro perspective, ultimately you can be changing prices at the borders, but if you're not affecting the underlying savings investment imbalance, you will not be affecting ultimately the current account. And that is also something that a lot of, again, it takes me back to what businessmen may not fully understand, because it's not the way it works in a company, is that there are, at the country level, they are actually affecting big prices, such as the exchange rate, if you implement the policy. And if I may, this one is not about the exchange rate, but it is related. There is a very, very common misconception which says that exports are bad and imports are no, the other way around. Exports are good and imports are bad. And somehow, for some reason, also that seems to come from an analogy. It's like, when I'm I'm selling something to somebody, which is like a revenue, and when I'm importing, that's like a cost. But of course, that's not how it works. Imports are the things that the people inside are consuming. That's pretty good. Or they may be the things that you put into your intermediates in order to even produce exports and local production. And there is one very strange, a very, very, very simple fallacy that also is related to this. The idea that it's better to export than to import is also shared by some people who just look at the way that we compute national income, which is, we put on all the sources like, of demand, government consumption of the private, investment, and then we deduct from that the net exports. And somehow that could create the idea that net exports are actually bad for you. And people have argued like that, and I'm talking about people in the, advising the US president. So it's not. It's a real example. Well, it turns out this is simply an accounting fallacy, because essentially the goods that are being imported have already been counted in the other sources of demand. Mm-hmm. So in the consumption and in the imports and in the investment. So it's basically an accounting convention of how we look at domestic production that leads to these kind of misunderstandings. So I think a lot really has also to do with education and better understanding of what are the underlying mechanisms, and the effects on the exchange rates are one of them.
All right, thanks a lot. So let's collect questions. Ralph, you want to start?
I have a question to Karl Gernandt. So it may be that there's no globalization backlash, but there's certainly a multilateralism backlash. I mean, the WTO is not doing particularly well. Preferential trade agreements have been proliferating. Trump just said he's not a big fan of the WTO, or is not a big fan of this, striking multilateral trade deals. So my question to you would be what this means for doing business as a logistics company, because in the trade literature, people have pointed out that this spaghetti bowl of trade agreements with very different regulations actually hinders trade quite a bit relative to this multilateral approach. So I'd just be curious from you as a logistics expert, what your take on that is.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's definitely a fact that the mess of trade agreements is kind of obstacle in terms of a constant flow of traded goods. But what we observe in reality is that even we might consider in an area of a bilateral trade agreement that things are going down, and it was very easy to observe during the Russian embargo and towards the with the European Union, that goods are normally finding their way, respectively, what the the politicians has signed in terms of trade agreements. That there's always a workaround. I'm not talking about pharmaceuticals being imported to Switzerland and being exported to other countries rather than to go directly from the US to the countries. I'm not talking about German apples, which are not allowed to be imported or exported to Russia, but they are exported to Pakistan, and then from Pakistan, apples. I'm talking stupid apples, not the apple product. and then they are re-imported from Pakistan to Russia. So reality is sometimes less intelligent or less elaborated than what we talk in these trade agreements. This is not a very sufficient answer to what you are describing, but at least it's a question which is answered by reality. Yes, we as a company transporting goods, we are definitely a strong fighter for trade agreements, for multinational trade agreements, and for free trade in general. But we are not active in politics, and we step aside and we react to what is going on in the markets.
We have another question here in the middle.
Yeah.
And then,
my question was triggered a bit by the graphs shown by Karl Gernandt about global trade flows. And I was taken aback and I said to myself, well, if you look at today's trade figures, those reflect decisions that were taken 6 months, 1 year, 6 years ago. They're not necessarily telling us anything about the future. And I'll just give you a picture from the trenches of global standard setting. I was for a while actively involved in the global standard setting of the insurance sector. Mm-hmm. After 2008, there was a clear determination that there should be global standards and everybody should adhere to them. Today, 2017, work on a capital standard for the insurance sector has practically stalled. It's not going anywhere. Work on working towards a common framework to regulate the internationally active insurance group has stalled, not going anywhere. Annual work on determination of systemically important insurers, not clear whether they will have lists this year. Reasons behind that, they have to do with Brexit, they have to do with the outcome of the US election. There's clearly a sea change, certainly currently. My question to the two academics, is this temporary or do we see a structural shift? My question to you, Laura, specifically, if you happen to be a financial services group domiciled in Switzerland, but with a big business abroad, how would you react today?
Diversify. So I think Beatrice mentioned, I do think in certain topics like financial regulation might be more structural, especially in terms of some of the regulation. In trade, I'm going to be honest, I don't think it has happened yet. I am more right now of the view that Trump just said a lot and has not done much. Let's keep in mind that many of the things he said he could do, like, for example, get out of NAFTA, put tariffs, and even call China a currency manipulator, he could have done them day one. He has the executive capacity to do it, and he has not done them yet. My understanding of the situation is that some business leaders went and explained, or perhaps he just got caught into something else. So I was very positive that it wouldn't happen, except that I have been talking to folks in negotiating NAFTA, and I got worried. To be honest, it's for the following. I think this is a person that, I do think the leadership matters, and this person has more power than, sadly, some of the people who put them there thought. And he needs wins, and he's not getting any win. He's not winning anything. So he might have something on taxes, and he will be fine. And if not, he will do NAFTA. And that's the part that worries me, that we might get bad policies out of some tantrum attack. So there is uncertainty.
Beatrice?
Yes. I mean, in the area of finance, as I was trying to elaborate before, I do think it's different. But it's already different from a starting point, because there is hardly any controversy about the question whether trade actually and opening borders is actually benefiting a country. I mean, there are distributional implications, and we can discuss this and have been discussing this. But when it comes to emerging markets and to developing countries, the consensus right now, the official consensus, IMF-led and everything that hangs with it, is actually that you have to be careful when liberalizing for capital flows. So there is, and there are lots of tools that you may want to put in place in order to make sure that that you don't liberalize too quickly, and and that includes capital controls, and that includes other macroprudential tools. What is new since the financial crisis is not only had the financial globalization been most massive across advanced countries, but that's also where now we are observing that the rules are diverging across countries. And the deglobalization, the retrenchment, even within the Eurozone. I mean, remember, the Eurozone fractioned across borders in terms of cross-border financing. I mean, that's why the ECB had to step in such a massive way in order to basically, take over this non-existing or this drying out of the interbank market, and in particular across borders. So part of that is reversed and will be reversed, but much of it won't. And I'm very much with you, sympathize with your feeling that the standards, the idea of setting standards is obviously that they should be as global as possible. But we are getting more and more regional and national standards, de jure and de facto. There is no such thing as a WTO for finance, and the Basel Committee is only partial. It's only regulating a part of the financial sector, and it's not the most dynamic one right now.
Although I think, in terms of finance, I would have thought that, that there's still sort of a leading role of the US, because essentially they can at least enforce some of their standards.
But they are at the forefront of, basically making rules for the US mainly. So, the US is not real, that's exactly, part of the problem. The US has already, since the financial crisis, been making rules, has been basically a trendsetter in making rules that apply to the US in a territorial and extraterritorial way.
Exactly. Yeah. But then they sort of enforce them to a broader set of countries by,
Right, but that's not the same thing as having a global rule or a global standard.
There were two questions in the back, actually in the middle. Yes.
Yeah, I want to ask Mr. Gernandt if his view of globalization is really sustainable. If he says, that was probably provocative, that there are only 3 really global products. Because that would mean that at the end of globalization, we not only eat the same hamburgers, but we have, regarding Costa Rica, only one sort of bananas, and regarding Switzerland, only one sort of cheese and one sort of chocolate, which would be a disaster, yeah? And I'm not sure if you understand that this cultural metaphor of globalization, that is a big fear of many of the enemies of globalization, that everything will be the same, and the money, of course, hamburgers, Apple, and Coke goes to the US. That's the main argument against globalization of cultural pessimists.
Maybe we could group, since we have the microphone there, take the second question as well. And then
that's fine with me. We actually observe a paradox globalization of nationalists and a paradox globalization of neo-nationalist resentments. Based on this, I think we really have to focus on the losers of present-day globalization to preserve the positive sides. Mr. Gernandt, you mentioned you don't have another side to maybe live up to certain kind of social engagement. Have you thought of because politicians are changing all the time, governments are changing all the time. Have you thought of an approach that follows more the line of a foundation, be it the Bill Gates type thing, And two brief questions addressed to Professor Alfaro. You're mentioning when you made some details on the glues of globalization, come from rural, uneducated, unwilling to change. I just want to ask you about unwilling to change. You're obviously a person who is willing to change. There are a lot of people in the room who were not born in Switzerland. We are here also because we are willing to change. Could it be that the people you showed on the picture from the film had a better life in manufacturing that they have now in service industry, and that's the reason why they're unwilling to change, very much in contrast to us, have a better life here in Switzerland than somewhere else? Question two, you were making the remark that you see the Cayman, the Paradise, the Panama Paper problem as a result of, quote, bad initial policies of the US and the US Congress. Well, now we see that through the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, all the people who run away from paying taxes on a legal way, on an illegal way, come from all countries. So following your line, that would mean we have bad initial policies everywhere. The question, what would be good initial tax policies everywhere? Close to zero taxes?
Well, Gernandt, do you want to start with that?
Okay, if I may start first with my provocation with the global products. You're absolutely right. There was a kind of setting an idea or giving a hint that by talking about globalization, we should stop in thinking that we have achieved globalization only because we have global products all around the world. And by anticipating that this is not the target, I've tried to explain it by the Unsinn, by Justin and the sketching of the three products, which are definitely not making the world better or lesser and good, but that they are the symbol for what we call globalization in a production world, which at the end of the day is not giving any value. And so far, thank you for clarifying that, and I do hope that I've not been misunderstood by others. Second question, I'm very thankful for that. I have the privilege to run the office of a wealthy man who has made his fortune with logistics, with global trade. And different than Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, we are not giving pledge of 50%, but of 100%. All of what we are generating as material value is handed over to a foundation. And this foundation is trying to do charity work around the globe. For example, humanitarian logistics in areas where nobody would run logistic projects or education or that kind of stuff. Does that answer a little bit the hint when I was asking whom I should address to? But I must disappoint you, last remark from my side. The Gates Foundation as well as the Kühne Foundation has major issues in finding the right partner for all our global projects. It's very easy to talk to say, let's go to the UN. Nobody at the UN wants to talk with us. While Fukushima happened, we were not even granted with an entry ticket to Japan with our support staff. So globalized world is even more reality in the business area than in the foundation environment. But this is only a side remark and doesn't fit to the overall setup.
Laura, on the unwilling to change.
So I'm trying to understand your question. It felt a little bit personal. I don't know what type of life you thought I was living in Costa Rica, but people in Costa Rica actually live a very good life. Having said that, I do think the brave new world people do need to embrace change. And the people who are willing to change and try new things are the ones that are doing better. And there might be many reasons why people don't change. I'm also sympathetic. And for example, in the global financial crisis, something that was tying the US more than before was the fact that houses had no value. And so people were not moving to find better jobs because they couldn't sell the house, or if they did, they wouldn't get enough. And that was tying them to that. But I'm thinking about something different, and I don't know if you remember the movie, but these were people that were not even willing to change. They didn't even want to try a different job. So they couldn't even compare because they were not doing it out of some glamour of what we were doing before, as opposed to working in the service sector. And I think here in the US, the coal industry is one that has this. I honestly, and if you believe that, I think we can happily disagree, I don't think there's a future in coal. And I don't think there should be a future in coal. For global reasons, for climate reasons, because there are other type of products, and shale gas and renewables, and that is the future. But if you see the current discourse in the US, it's making them believe that it's okay to stay with that. Yeah. And I think that is the problem. Yeah.
And that's even though it's not clear those are very good jobs, actually.
They're not even good jobs. They probably had health problems. It's not the biggest share of GDP in the US. The total share of GDP of agriculture and mining is less than 2% of GDP. So it's not even important. And the current leadership is selling those are great jobs and we're going to do everything for you to stay there. And so that is the type of problem that I do see. Taxes, look, I'm not a tax expert. Taxes are complicated. I'm of the view that right now we're not going to get global solutions for many reasons. But in many things, probably you also don't need really global solutions. There are some big countries that matter. The US is one of them. And I think Europe, the European Union, is also another one. But I do think if the US had better policies, tax-wise, which, by the way, they're not going to get, we wouldn't have Apple going from Ireland to Jersey. We wouldn't have all these Cayman Islands. We wouldn't have Bermuda. A lot of that, and I'm telling you just from a paper that I recently saw, was because of tax changes the US did in the 70s and 80s that allow for that to explode. So it does have like an origin that could be tackled. And I don't believe we need zero taxes. I actually do believe that there are things the government should do, and thus we should tax.
Beatrice, you wanted to chime in?
Oh, I just wanted
to change.
Yeah, the willingness to change, or people should embrace change. I think that relates to our discussion also about populism and the prospects for populism, because clearly one of the drivers behind populist movements has been a certain nostalgia for past. Let's go back to the way the country was, when it was still our country, and it was, more uniform and more monocultural, and there were coal jobs around, among other things. I mean, when I think about what are the prospects of populism and look at who actually votes for populist parties, and this turns out to be quite similar. Well, in the two Anglo-Saxon countries anyway, people who vote for Trump and vote for Brexit have similar characteristics, but also turns out is not so different for the AfD, that there is one characteristic which is, it has to do with where they live, rural versus city. That has to do with educational level, but also with age. And the older people tend to vote more populist. And what is important about that, I think one of the most impressive tables I've seen, it's a very simple thing, for Brexit. How many years will people have to live with the consequences? Well, those who predominantly voted for leave will live with the consequences, on average expected about 20 years. Whereas those who predominantly voted for remain will live with the consequences something between 60 and 80 years. And I think that is actually an important point. If our aging societies are going to be more backward-looking in the future, then there is something that needs to be said about this. Then there's something that an awareness we have to take of this, because the distributional consequences across generations are massive. And the right, basically, of deciding for the young people who may not be able to have this, chances that we have had, it's basically it's a question of fairness. And so my last point would be I really hope that that the prospects for populism will not be as good as they may have seemed, because on the one hand side the costs will become visible as we go along, and second, because others are stepping in. I mean, this is the moment of Europe and Asia to step in and really become the ones that sustain a global open order.
All right, unfortunately we're out of time, so thank you very much for this fascinating panel, and we'll have a break of about half an hour.